Hello, this is Dr. Heather Lee, and this is a continued instruction about classroom management. And this is the beginning of part 2. Now, part 1 took several videos, I believe 3, and parts 2 and 3 hopefully will be shorter. But it goes to reinforce the idea that there is a lot behind classroom management. There's a lot of planning and thinking and preparing that goes on before you actually manage students in a classroom. And that's very critical for any teacher to think through. So we're going to begin talking about part 2, which is having effective procedures and guidelines for your students. Some people, or you might just call these the rules. You know, what are the rules of your classroom? But we're going to call them procedures and guidelines because it's a little bit more of a positive way to state it. And we're going to talk about 3 parts: having clear expectations, thinking through in advance what the consequences will be for those who don't follow those rules or procedures, guidelines, and then finally, managing class sessions, what you can do to prevent problems based on the way that you manage a class session. And I like this quote because it reminds us of what we're doing right now. We are preparing for a future classroom, and that preparation leads to confidence and success. Your confidence as a teacher is very, very important. And in this area of classroom management, if you are not prepared, you won't be confident and you won't be successful. So this preparation and thinking through all of these parts is a way to help you become more confident and ultimately successful in the classroom. So let's start by talking about these procedures and guidelines, all right? You want to clearly tell your students how they should behave in your classroom. What are your expectations? And again, it's a good idea to say, these are my expectations. These are the guidelines for how our classroom will run. Instead of thinking about them as just, here are the rules and here's a punishment. But a positive way to say it, that here are my expectations, and this is what will naturally follow if you make the choice to not follow these guidelines. So you want to make sure that they're very clear and positive. So saying do instead of don't is a great idea. Consistently following them. Listen, listen, listen. Any rule that you don't consistently reinforce is going to fail. It will not last. So your consistency is critical. Don't ask your students to do something if you cannot or will not every single time make sure the rule is followed. Buy-in from students. This is where you might have a discussion with your students. You're very clear about what it looks like, why these guidelines are important, and sometimes even allowing your students to give input and create the rules themselves and create the wording so that they will agree that this is how they want the classroom to run and everybody agrees to it. Having about 5 or less is a good idea, and not being super specific. When you only have 5 or so rules, it's hard to be super specific. You need to have enough so that they can encompass all that needs to be encompassed. So let me give you 3 different examples of a set of classroom expectations. Here is one. Sorry, give me just a minute. Okay, here's a first example for a high school classroom, and here's what the teacher has written down. First, arrive promptly with the needed materials and stay on task until you're excused by the teacher. And this is a great thing if you can establish this right away. The teacher, not the bell, excuses the students. Now, of course, you want to excuse them right around the time of the bell, but you don't want your students, when the bell rings, standing up no matter what you're saying, just standing up and walking away. So establish the fact that you are the one who excused the teacher, the students. Here's rule number 2, expectation number 2. Demonstrate respect for the rights, the person, and the property of others. Remain seated and listen attentively when someone else is talking. Use appropriate and non-offensive language. Work on anchor assignments whenever you have time in class. And an anchor assignment is simply, what do they do whenever there's downtime? It could be as simple as reading or a journal prompt or an ongoing something that they're trying to find out about, working on the current project, the current homework. But make sure your students know what to do before you start class, whenever there's a lag or you need a couple minutes, or maybe you're interrupted and you need your students to do something for 5 minutes while you take care of something. So those anchor assignments are very important. So that's one example, and you're welcome to use any of these rules or procedures for the ones that you create for your future classroom. Here's another example. I love this one. This is technically from a middle school classroom, but I like that it's kind of catchy, but it's also, it clearly tells the students what the rules mean. So the first one is be on time. That means that you are in your seat and ready to go when the bell rings. And let me tell you, middle schoolers need that kind of specificity. You're in your seat and ready to go when the bell rings. Number two, be respectful. We are equally important in this class and deserve respect. Number three, be ready to learn. Have your homework and other materials out and ready to go. That's great. It's a specific way to say what it means to be ready to learn. Instead of just saying, you're not ready to learn, it's, is your homework out or your materials ready to go? Be a follower of classroom procedures. You see how broad that one is. So any procedure that the teacher has taught, you need to follow them. And be safe. Don't create a hazard for you or your classmates. And again, I like these. A teacher could simply refer to, there's one more, be thoughtful. Treat others as you would want to be treated. And I like these because you can refer to the be part of it, be on time, be ready to learn, and it reminds your students to look at this and to be following this procedure. So there's an example from middle school. And finally, here's an example of something that's a more democratic model. It's called a Student Bill of Rights, and this is where you would lead your students in a discussion at the very beginning of the year of the rules and procedures for the classroom. And so they would create it, and you end up with something like this. As a student in Ms. Orland's class, you would put your name there. I intend to. And this class came up with these expectations. Show respect for others and their property. Act responsibly. That means I'll have materials and homework ready when required. Be safe. Demonstrate politeness. Cooperate with teachers and fellow students. Engage in learning activities. And ask questions. I apologize for the 2 typos there. Ask questions when I don't understand how my behavior affects others. So they came up with this together, and what a teacher would typically do is have this printed out and go ahead and have the students take it home, sign it. Parents may even sign it and bring it back to class, and it's collected, probably even as a homework assignment. And that way everybody is agreeing to it, and when they may not follow those rules, you can say, hey, you agreed to this. This is how we agreed that our classroom is going to run. So there's another way to go about it. But some key things to remember here. You must be consistent. Think about whether you can really be consistent and follow through on these procedures. You also need to be fair. Now, fair does not mean that everybody gets the same treatment, because there are times when you need to make exceptions or allowances. For example, one of your guidelines might be that students should be in their seat during class time, but you may have a student who is so active and needs to move around that you have an arrangement with that student that they can get up and stand at the back of the classroom, not distract anybody, but just to get out some of that energy. And that way they can learn and they won't be a hindrance to other people. That's an example of something that's not the same, but it's fair because you're giving that student what they need. It also should be appropriate, all right? For the age level of your students, for the background of your students, it should be something that makes sense for them and is appropriate, and also follow school guidelines. You don't ever want to be in a situation where you make a rule or you say this is what's going to happen to a student, and then the principal finds out and says, I don't think so. That's not what we do at our school. So you want to make sure that you read beforehand about your school's guidelines. You might find out your school already has a set of rules that you need to follow and set consequences so that things are very consistent in the school. And if that's the case, you should be respectful to those and consistently reinforce them. Now, when you think about the consequences, there are so many different ways to do this. You need to find a way that works for you, that you can be consistent with, that you can teach class, but then give the appropriate consequences as needed. But you want to think along the lines that when something happens the first time, a first offense, don't go all crazy. Don't have some kind of a big consequence the first time someone talks out of turn. But instead, the first time it happens, it should be a direct but kind of unobtrusive. Many times it's just a look to the student. Something subtle that just says, hey, rule number 1, or a reminder to the teacher and the student so that they know, hey, please don't do that, okay? Then if it happens again, a second offense, typically in the same class period, that might result in a private but a more direct verbal warning. So maybe you would end up at that student's seat and you just lean down and say, please don't talk. Please do not continue to talk with your neighbor during class. Wait until blank. You would have some kind of a controlled but more direct warning. Then you would have something set up beforehand, maybe the 3rd, 4th, or 5th, and there's a variety of things. It might be a private conference. You might call in your parents at some point. You might involve the principal at some point, a suspension. Obviously, those are much more serious things. And so you need to have a balance here. You can't have it's the 15th time that you call the principal or the 15th time a student talks out, because who can keep track of that? I mean, that's not going to happen. On the other hand, your principal does not want you to be involving them with small little things. You need to feel out what's appropriate in your school, what's not appropriate. So you need to be prepared to handle most of this in your classroom in a way that is gentle at first, not too obtrusive, doesn't embarrass them, but lets them know, hey, remember the rule? And the second time, hey, I'm very serious about that. Please stop talking. The third time it could be, I'm going to need you to move to that seat in the back. And so something that you have set up beforehand and you have already explained to your students. So it's not a surprise and you're not pulling things out of a hat. But you have an idea of where you're going. Here are some examples of things that are not appropriate. If you are being arbitrary or inconsistent, students never know what to expect from you. Giving them extra homework or extra assignments is not appropriate because you want to have a positive approach to work. You want your students to know that the reason you write is to think through your ideas, to express them to other people. You want it to be a positive thing, not a punishment. You should not embarrass your students, punish a whole group or a whole class when chances are it wasn't the whole class that was misbehaving, maybe half, maybe even 5 or 6. You shouldn't be harsh or humiliating. Yelling at students is not appropriate. Lowering their grades for behavior. Nagging them, including this shh, shh, shh that teachers often get in the habit of doing in the classroom. We shush students instead of just saying, ladies and gentlemen, it's too loud in here. Please lower the volume as you're working in your groups. Okay, that is much more effective than going around saying shh, 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 because really they just ignore it. It doesn't clearly state what you're looking for. Having a negative touch, maybe a hand on the shoulder that's kind of firm or something when you're upset with them, do not do that. Keep your hands to yourself. Overreacting, especially if maybe you're not in a good mood that day. Physical punishment, premature judgment and actions, and threats and ultimatums. You want to make sure that you never threaten something or say, if you don't be quiet, nobody is leaving this classroom when the bell rings. Well, you're not going to be able to follow through on that. So make sure you don't say what you don't mean. But at the same time, you can't be too hesitant. You have to be willing and ready to say what you mean and to do it. But it needs to be thought through beforehand so that it's very clearly appropriate. We're going to continue this discussion in the next video, but be thinking about what are the types of rules, what are the expectations that I think are great to have in my class.